I never thought that helping Josh with his homework would turn into one of the most unforgettable nights of my life. The house was quiet, wrapped in the thick stillness of late evening. A soft golden glow from the desk lamp bathed the living room in warmth. The only sound filling the space was the faint scratching of a pencil against paper. Outside, the city hummed in the distance, its lights flickering against the darkened sky. Josh sat across from me, his brows drawn together in deep concentration, his fingers gripping the pencil as he worked through the equations I had just explained. His hair was slightly tousled from the way he kept running his hand through it in frustration, and in the low light, the sharp angles of his jaw and cheekbones seemed even more pronounced. I shifted in my chair, crossing one leg over the other, feeling the smooth silk of my robe slide against my skin. It wasn't intentional, but when I saw the flicker of his gaze, just for a second, down toward the exposed sliver of my thigh, something inside me stirred. It was the first moment, subtle, fleeting, but unmistakable. "You're overcomplicating it," I murmured, leaning slightly forward. My voice was even, controlled. Josh exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. His t-shirt stretched across his shoulders, the muscles flexing slightly under his skin. "Yeah, maybe." His voice was deeper now, rougher than I remembered. He had always been quiet, reserved, but there was something about the way he carried himself now that felt different. Older. I stood, moving around the table to stand behind him. "Here," I said, peering over his shoulder. "Let me show you." I reached down, my fingers grazing the back of his hand as I pointed to the numbers on the page. The moment our skin touched, Josh stilled. His breath hitched almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. The heat of his body, so close, so solid, was impossible to ignore. My fingertips burned where they had brushed against his. A simple touch, innocent even, but the way Josh turned his head slightly, his eyes flickering up at me from beneath thick lashes, sent something electric through my spine. For a moment, the air between us was charged, heavy, thick with something unspoken. I stepped back suddenly, too suddenly, my breath catching in my throat. "Keep trying," I said quickly, my voice strained, and I turned toward the kitchen, desperate to put space between us. I grabbed a glass from the counter, filling it with water, but my hands trembled slightly. The reflection in the window showed Josh still sitting there, but he wasn't looking at his book anymore. He was looking at me. And this time, he didn't look away. I took a slow sip of water, but my throat was already dry. Behind me, I could still feel his gaze, heavy and lingering. It was the kind of stare that pressed into my skin, igniting something I wasn't ready to name. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just my mind playing tricks, twisting something innocent into something forbidden. I was his stepmother. He was my husband's son. And yet, as I turned back toward the table, I caught the way Josh's eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, before snapping back to his notebook. He knew I had seen him looking, and he didn't seem the least bit ashamed. I exhaled through my nose, steadying myself. "Are you stuck again?" I asked, forcing my voice into something neutral, something that didn't betray the way my pulse had quickened. Josh dragged his tongue along the inside of his cheek, thoughtful, before shaking his head. "No, I think I got it now." He picked up his pencil, but the way he held it, tight, tense, told me he wasn't as focused as he wanted to be. I sat back down across from him, watching as he wrote down the next steps, his fingers flexing slightly with each movement. The room felt warmer now, the air thick with something I didn't want to acknowledge. The silk of my robe clung to my skin, a little too thin, a little too revealing under the soft golden light. I shifted in my seat, and his eyes flickered up again, catching the movement. A slow inhale, a clench of his jaw. I shouldn't have noticed these things, but I did. "That's good," I murmured, nodding toward his work, trying to focus on the numbers rather than the way my heartbeat had started hammering in my chest. Josh exhaled, running a hand through his hair again. "Yeah, thanks for helping me with this." he said, his voice lower than before, rough around the edges. I smiled. Small, composed. Of course. But the moment stretched too long. Neither of us moved. The air pulsed between us, charged and dangerous, and I knew deep down that something had already shifted. The problem wasn't the touch of my fingers against his hand. It wasn't the way his gaze lingered, or the way my breath caught when he looked at me. The problem was that neither of us had pulled away. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but neither of us mentioned it. Josh leaned back in his chair, stretching, his muscles shifting beneath the thin fabric of his shirt. His arms lifted above his head, exposing a sliver of skin where his t-shirt had ridden up. Firm, toned, the sharp lines of his abdomen barely visible in the dim light. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. And when I dragged my gaze back to his face, he was watching me. Neither of us spoke. The air between us thickened, slow and heavy like warm honey, stretching the silence into something tangible, something charged. I swallowed, pressing my thighs together beneath the table. "You should probably get some sleep," I murmured, my voice lower than I intended. Josh didn't move. "You're probably right." But he didn't stand up. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, a steady rhythm before he reached for his pencil again. But this time, he dropped it. It rolled off the edge of the table, landing near my feet. Josh moved without thinking, crouching down to grab it just as I shifted in my seat. Our movements collided. His shoulder brushed against my bare knee, his fingers grazing my ankle. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt straight through me. I sucked in a sharp breath. Josh froze. His hand hovered just above my skin, his fingertips barely an inch away from where my robe had parted at my thigh. For a second, neither of us moved, both caught in that space between accident and intention. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his gaze. I should have pulled away. I should have crossed my legs, straightened my robe, done anything to break the moment before it could become something else. But I didn't. And neither did he. His fingers, warm and tentative, brushed against my calf this time. A slow, deliberate touch, just enough to test the boundary we were dancing around. A slow exhale left my lips, shaky, unsteady. Josh's jaw tightened, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "I should go," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I nodded, my breath shallow. "Yeah, you should." But neither of us moved. Not yet. Josh's hand was still there, light, tentative, a barely there touch against my calf, but it burned. I should have moved. I should have crossed my legs, closed the space between us, done anything to sever the connection before it became something we couldn't take back. But I didn't. Instead, I let my breath stutter, let my fingers curl slightly into the fabric of my robe, let the heat from his skin seep into mine. Josh's gaze flickered up, locking onto mine. His pupils were dark, blown wide, his lips slightly parted as if he were about to say something, but he didn't. He just watched me. Slowly, deliberately, his fingertips traced higher, just barely skimming up the curve of my calf. My skin tingled, every nerve hyper-aware of the slow, agonizing drag of his touch. He wasn't rushing. He was testing, waiting for me to stop him. But I didn't. A sharp inhale left me, shaky and uneven. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table, my nails pressing into the wood. I was still sitting, still holding myself together, but barely. Josh moved closer, shifting onto his knees, his body now between my legs. His breath was warm, unsteady, fanning over the exposed skin of my thigh. My robe had fallen open slightly, the silk pooling around me, and I felt the weight of his gaze settle there. This was wrong. I knew it. But when his hand slid higher, just a whisper of pressure against my skin, my thighs trembled. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Josh's breath hitched. He looked up at me again, his eyes questioning, waiting. I should have stopped this. I should have told him to get up, to walk away, to forget this ever happened. But then his fingers brushed higher, the tips of them barely grazing the inside of my thigh, and a soft, broken sound slipped from my lips before I could swallow it down. That was all it took. Something snapped. Josh's grip tightened. Firm now, no longer tentative. His palm pressed against the sensitive skin of my thigh, his fingers digging in just enough to make my breath shudder out of me. My voice was nothing more than a whisper, lost beneath the tension curling between us. Josh leaned in, his face just inches from mine. I could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the rapid rise and fall of his chest, the way his fingers flexed against me as if he was barely holding himself back. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice rough, unsteady. The silence between us was deafening. Josh's fingers pressed into my thigh, warm and firm, his touch no longer hesitant. His body was so close, between my legs, his breath ghosting over my skin, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. I should have said something. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. Instead, I felt my own breath falter, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table as heat coiled low in my stomach. My robe had fallen further apart, the silk slipping down my shoulder, exposing more of me to the low glow of the lamp, and to him. Josh's gaze dropped, his jaw clenched, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. His hands twitched against me as if fighting the urge to go further. "Tell me to stop," he said again, his voice rough, almost desperate. I opened my mouth, but no words came. Because I didn't want him to stop. The realization sent a shiver through me, dark, thrilling, undeniable. Josh's grip on my thigh tightened, his fingers pressing into the sensitive skin there, and my legs instinctively parted just slightly, a movement so small I might have convinced myself it was unintentional. But we both knew better. A sharp inhale left him, his hands sliding higher, tracing the curve of my leg with excruciating slowness. His touch sent fire racing through me, every nerve in my body alight, aching, needing. I let out a shaky breath. Josh's gaze snapped to mine, searching, waiting for any sign of hesitation. There was none. And that was all it took. His grip on me became bolder, his hands exploring with newfound certainty. His breath was warm against my skin, and when I felt his lips, just barely, just a whisper of a touch, I let my head tip back, a quiet, shuddering exhale slipping past my lips. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. The space between us had disappeared. Josh's fingers traced slow, deliberate patterns against my thigh, the warmth of his palm pressing firmly into my skin. Every touch was heavier now, no longer testing, no longer tentative. I should have stopped him. I should have closed my legs, pushed him away, pretended none of this was happening. But my body betrayed me. A quiet exhale slipped from my lips, barely a sound, but Josh heard it. He felt it. His breath caught, his fingers tightening against me, and then, slowly, he moved higher. My pulse pounded in my ears, heat pooling low in my stomach as his hands explored, mapping the shape of me with agonizing slowness. The silk of my robe was weightless against my skin, slipping, shifting, falling away as if it, too, had surrendered to the moment. Josh's breath was warm against my collarbone, his lips hovering, so close, just a breath away. My hands, which had been gripping the chair, finally moved on their own. Fingertips brushed against his forearms, trailing up, feeling the tense, corded muscles beneath his skin. He was shaking. Or maybe I was. His lips finally grazed my shoulder, just barely, a whisper of heat against bare skin, and my stomach tightened, a slow ache unraveling inside me. It wasn't a kiss. Not really, but it was enough to make my breath stutter, my thighs clench around him instinctively. A quiet groan rumbled in his chest. His fingers flexed against me, gripping harder, hungrier, before slipping beneath the folds of my robe. I gasped. Josh stilled. For the first time, hesitation flickered in his gaze as if waiting for me to break the moment, to tell him this was a mistake. But I didn't. Instead, my fingers curled against his skin, pulling him closer, wordlessly telling him what neither of us dared to say aloud. The world outside the walls of this house didn't exist anymore. There was only this moment, only the quiet, heavy breaths between us, only the warmth of his hands exploring, only the way my body trembled beneath his touch. Josh's fingers curled around my thigh, his grip firm now, no longer hesitant. He was learning me, reading the silent cues of my body, every reaction, every subtle shift, every shaky breath that slipped past my lips. It told him everything he needed to know. I wanted this. His other hand lifted, tracing the edge of my robe where it had slipped from my shoulder. His knuckles brushed against my bare skin, leaving fire in their wake. Then, slowly, deliberately, he slid the silk fabric further down, his fingers ghosting over my collarbone, my arm, until the robe hung loosely around me, barely covering anything at all. A slow, trembling exhale left me. Josh's gaze flickered to my lips. For a second, neither of us moved. The air between us was electric, charged with everything we weren't saying. His chest rose and fell in deep, uneven breaths. His jaw clenched. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but there were no words left. Only need. And then, finally, he moved. His hand slid up, fingers grazing my jaw, tilting my face toward his. The moment stretched unbearably, a slow pull, a collision waiting to happen. My own breath caught, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I could feel the heat radiating from him, his lips just inches from mine. The first brush. A feather-light touch, a mere whisper of his lips against mine. Just a tease, just enough to make me exhale sharply, my hands gripping his arms, my body arching slightly toward him. He pulled back, just barely, his breath shaky. His forehead rested against mine for a fleeting second, as if savoring the moment before surrendering to it completely. And then he kissed me. Deep, slow, consuming. A quiet sound escaped me as his lips pressed fully against mine, no longer tentative, no longer holding back. His hands roamed, one tangling in my hair, the other gripping my waist, pulling me closer, pressing our bodies together in a way that left no space, no hesitation. I was lost in it. The heat, the pressure, the way his lips moved against mine, hungry, aching, as if he had wanted this for longer than either of us dared to admit. His fingers slid lower, gripping the back of my thigh, lifting me effortlessly. My legs wrapped around his waist instinctively, my robe falling further open, barely clinging to my shoulders now. Josh groaned against my mouth, his hands gripping tighter, his body pressing into mine with a need that made my breath shatter. He walked us backward, my back meeting the cool surface of the table, his body caging me in, heat radiating between us, the world tilting around us. His lips left mine only to trail lower, down my jaw, my neck, his breath scorching against my skin. My hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, needing more, needing everything. We were right on the edge. My robe had slipped almost entirely now, his fingers skimming the bare skin beneath. His body pressed flush against mine, his weight, his heat, every part of him telling me exactly how much he wanted this, how much he wanted asterisk me. Asterisk! I gasped as his lips traced lower, as his hands gripped tighter. My nails raked against his shoulders, and he let out a low, strained groan, his body tensing against mine. Josh's hands were everywhere now, trailing fire over my skin, gripping, exploring, claiming. His breath was uneven, rough, and when his lips crashed against mine again, there was no hesitation left. The restraint had shattered. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, pressing my body flush against his. The table beneath me was solid, grounding, but everything else felt like a fever dream. His warmth, his weight, the way his hands moved with certainty now, no longer questioning, no longer waiting for permission. I had already given it. A quiet gasp slipped from my lips as his mouth left mine, trailing down my neck, his breath hot against my skin. I arched into him, my body answering before my mind could catch up, heat unfurling in my stomach, need pooling low and deep. Josh groaned against my skin, the sound vibrating through me, making my thighs tighten around his waist. His grip on me was possessive now, fingers pressing into my hips, dragging me closer, closer, until there was nothing left between us but heat and desire. The silk of my robe was barely clinging to my body now, slipping from my shoulders, pooling around me like water. Josh's hands traced the newly exposed skin, slow at first, appreciative, reverent, before gripping tighter, rougher, like he couldn't help himself anymore. His mouth found mine again, desperate, hungry, consuming. His fingers slid higher, skimming, teasing, until a shudder racked through me, my nails digging into his shoulders. I was unraveling. Josh exhaled sharply, his forehead pressing against mine for a brief second, his breath ragged. "I've wanted this for so long," he murmured, his voice raw, thick with everything he wasn't saying. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I didn't let myself think. I just pulled him back down to me. There was no hesitation left. No guilt. No stopping. Josh's hands tightened on my body, and I let my robe slip from my shoulders completely, surrendering to the moment, to him, to everything we had been trying so hard to deny. And then,